this river reconnaissance report. And as you know, this is a draft report, so we're here to make comments so that the final version contains what you want to see in it. So we're here to help identify things that we're thinking, things that are great, and things that you want to see more of. As you know, the watershed partnership is a community-based group that was formed to address stream health, particularly with respect to the ability of the stream to carry and handle high flows. And of course, the flood damages of 2005 was the real impetus for this project. And under the restoration program from the Department of Environmental Conservation has graciously funded this startup project to get us going. And this report is the first step in comprehensively reviewing stream conditions, both man-made and natural, with the idea that the funding will help determine and guide the most cost-effective approaches to minimizing risk and also enhancing the harmonious relationship between humans and the stream. This meeting today and the upcoming stakeholder meeting on February 18th that you've probably heard about, that will be at the Holiday Inn from 6 to 9, are really critical in taking us support to the next step, to get feedback from you. So to that end, we'll talk about that in a second, our hand-ups. But our goals today are simply to identify and collect constructive feedback from you to improve and enhance the final version of the river reconnaissance report. As we move forward in this project, we want to be looking at options for minimizing risk and improving the health of the stream. So to that end, what I thought we could just do real quick is just go around the room and say your name and where you're from, what your title is. I'm Candace Palmer. I'm the project coordinator for Lower Sixth Watershed Partnership. I also am a water resource specialist for a nonprofit called our Path Solutions.
Kathy Lancaster, hydrogeologist at the Northern Ocean Nuclear Sciences, and I'm going to be doing some interface work between the members of the project and our technical analysis.
Hi, I'm Mary. I'm also from Conservative Conservation Society, Committee of Volunteer.
Yeah, guys, it's John here from DEC. I'm Habitat Manager for Region 3. Chief Fire, County Stormwater and Systems Project.
Chuck Cuppett, I'm with the Hudson Restaurant Program, and I'm the manager of the project for DEC.
Mike Flaherty, I'm with Landscape and Fisheries Manager for Region 3. Dan Davis, geologist for the DEC Stream Management Program, and I manage the Stream Management Program in the Chiltern Basin.
I'm Bart from Davenport Farm.
Jim MacBroom, hydraulic engineer.
This is Pat, the Reconnaissance campaign, and I'm a woman.
Jeremy Cannon with the Town of Saugerty Planning Show.
That's Rachel with the New York City DEP Stream Management Program.
John Roby from HCR. Dave Gazzo, Hurley Conservation Advisory Council.
Mary McNair, Fossil Watershed Alliance.
So what I thought we should do is let me go through for a few minutes, walk through some of the process we went through and doing the reconnaissance survey of the lower South Creek. We'll look at a little bit some of the findings, and then we can have more of a general discussion on the results and where we have comments that should be added to leave this report and supplemental work may be needed. But basically, we look at the river as being a product of its watershed. And the watershed, as you may recall, goes up into the central Catskills, about 419 square miles. We're measured at the Mount Marion gauge. The total watershed area is measured at the Hudson River, so it's bigger. The gauge is all the way to the mouth of the watershed. But I was starting to say, the river is really a product of its watershed. And so we begin first by looking at the watershed, not the river. And the processes that take place in the watershed really drive what happens in the river itself. This is a river where the watershed is about 419 square miles when measured at the Mount Marion gauge. But the true watershed size is measured at the Hudson River, so it's bigger, and I haven't found that exact number. Probably like 430 or something like that. The independent factors that affect the river downstream can be defined very quickly, but they're the factors that are outside the valley itself. And by that I mean that we have watershed hydrology, which is the amount of water that flows into the system, and that's something that comes from upstream. The second major driving force on the river system is the amount of sediment and the type of sediment that's in the system. That's a product of the watershed itself, not of the channel. Then we look at the general topography of the watershed and how it shapes the valleys and how the valleys shape the river. So the river is basically created by these outside factors. Other valley factors which are very important here is the slope of the valleys and how it's been influenced by bedrock formation. This is very strong in this particular river, more so than many of the ones we look at. The dependent variables that we look at, and those are which are, variables that are related to the river channel itself, are the slope of the channel, what we call the pattern. The pattern of the channel is as if you're looking at it from an airplane, or looking at it on a paper map, and looking down at the channel. Some channels can be straight, and some channels can be sinuous, some channels will have multiple branches on them, we'll call them anabranch channel. And that's very much a function of the independent variables that I mentioned earlier in the watershed, such as the sediment load and the topography and the flow range. And those kind of create the pattern and create the slope of the downstream channel. Then we look at variables such as the width of the channel and the depth of the channel, how that compares to normal flood flows and how that may compare to modified flood flows. In other words, we think of three temporal aspects over time. The first temporal aspect is always going to be the natural conditions prior to European colonists coming to the Catskill Mountains. The second temporal time frame is always going to be existing conditions. The third temporal time frame that I look at is what happens in the future. And you might extend that into a fourth kind of like hypothetical time frame. What happens in the future if we manage the system as opposed to simply looking at future conditions if we do nothing. So we always have to have the context of space and the concept of time. Other dependent variables that take place in the channel that affect flooding and affect its ecology are going to be the roughness of the channel, the slope of the banks of the channel, the type or lack of vegetation on the banks. And all these are very dependent on the independent variables that I mentioned before. And so we went through the process of first looking at the topography of the watershed and the geology of the watershed. And we began, as the Ocean began, and just kind of followed it downstream. And what I find is that within the reef that we were at to study, we have three very distinctly different types of valleys. And these valley types, as I call them, really control what the river does. The first valley type coming downstream from the dam and ending in Hurley Mountain Road, not too far from here, about 6 miles long, relatively steep channel, and it's confined, which means we have a narrow valley coming down out of the foothills of the mountainous area. There's a lot of exposed bedrock on it. And by and large, that section of the channel is not prone to dams causing flooding. It doesn't have much development. Close to the channel, there's a few isolated homes and farming areas. By and large, we'll think it's relatively rural. The second valley segment that we look at is a long valley segment, about 16 miles long, and it runs from Hurley Mountain Road all the way down to the Lake Mill Road, which is at the other end of the valley, up in the north end. And I believe it's also called Route 30, is it, or Route 32? What's that? Yeah. And at that point, the valley is now becoming confined again by bedrock. And there's falls at that point, which is what we call a grade control. So the elevation of the channel bed is actually controlled by the bedrock at Lake Mill Road. There's an exposure of bedrock, and upstream of that point, most of the way up to Marbleton, the channel is very, very flat. There's very little gradient to it. And that's one reason we have some difficulty moving substantial quantities of water. The only energy that the river has is from gravity. And it's applied to the slope of the channel. When you have a channel with no slope, you don't have river flow conditions. Then we look at the hydrology of the watershed. And the hydrology of this watershed is what I call bimodal. In other words, it operates under two different scenarios. We have 419 square miles of land draining through gauge. But of that area, a substantial part has watershed hydrology which is modified by a series of reservoirs, not only the New York City reservoir, but also the reservoir that's up in Woodstock that serves the city of Kingston, and the smaller reservoirs over on the Plateau. So we have modified hydrology under low flow conditions when the reservoir is not spilling a lot of water. And then we have the full watershed hydrology if you have a major flood and the reservoirs are spilling. And so it's a bimodal type of system, which means that you're gauging station data is difficult to use directly, because you don't know, without doing a lot more research, on which days the gauge is reflecting spillage from the reservoir and which days it's not reflecting spillage. So it's like a two-phase type of system. What I ended up doing after kind of looking at the valley types is that I divided the river into smaller pieces. You might say, in order to understand how the river works, we look at bite-sized pieces. So with the three major valley types, each of which is bedrock influence. And then within those, we have smaller, what we call a river reach, which is defined by fairly consistent geology, fairly consistent channel width, fairly consistent slope, and discharge. So the reaches tend to be a smaller division of the river as it flows through the valley. And we can look at these one by one, so that they're kind of like something to get your arms around, basically. And we end up having a total of 10 different reaches that we assess in the field. And this is a very limited type of budget assessment, so we use a lot of remote sensing. In other words, a lot of desktop type information can be used. I look at information from aerial photographs and satellite photographs. I look at the GIS information from the state DEC. We look at the FEMA flood insurance study. Then we go out in the field, and we have limited access to the river within the time frame. Go to public access points, the bridges, various places we see open space along the river. Kind of walk through the woods, we look at the channel, get some kind of physical feeling for it, particularly in terms of the type of substrate and the type of bank material and the dimensions of the channel. And from that, we begin having some understanding of the river processes that take place and how it conveys water, how it conveys sediment. And at the same time, we're looking at the modifications to the channel and modifications to the land use within the valley bottom. As you may know, that the main section of the valley bottom is what we call Valley Section 2, Crowley Mountain Road down to Route 28 Lake Mill Road. The broad valley, the channel is undercut, which means the size of the channel is not proportional to the valley. The valley was carved out by glacier. It was partly influenced by the type of bedrock. We saw limestone deposits in the banks. Limestone deposits are usually very soluble but easily eroded. We believe that's why the valley is so flat on the bottom in terms of its longitudinal slope. Whereas when you go north of Lake Mill Road, all of a sudden the bedrock geology changes. And those regions turn into a shale. And we found two different types of bedrock shale. The first type is highly warped and twisted and subject to compression. And we see that up around, I think you may know this. North of Glen Eyre Falls. What's the name of the road there? Yes, exactly. The bedrock can be warped and twisted, and that's actually forming this narrow channel that the flow is from. But if you look at the flow itself, the bedrock is the same type of shale, but in horizontal layers, very similar to what we found through the Catskill area. So it's a different formation. And these have had a great influence on how the river forms and the shape and size of the channel. And then we basically look at the flood hazards along the channel. And unfortunately, probably the most important document we have on the whole system is the FEMA flood insurance study, which is in a draft form. And we understand it's not been finalized yet. But the flood insurance study does several very helpful things. First of all, it defines the hydrology of the river as seen by the federal agencies and federal government, and defines what the peak flow rates are. And that's been taken from the gauging information on areas. Second, it provides a very important profile of the riverbed. It's as if you look at the river sideways and you see the slope of the channel as it goes in the downstream direction. And finally, it provides elevations of the floodwaters for the 10, 50, 100, and 500-year frequency floods. Floods that have a statistical reoccurrence of that frequency. If you take the inverse, we think of a 100-year flood. Many lay people will think it happens once in 100 years. Statistically, that's correct. It's better to define a 100-year flood as an event that has a 1% chance of occurring in any given year. Over the last few years, you've had the luck of the draw. In other words, you've had some very substantial floods for the last 3 or 4 years. So even though the events might even have a 1% chance of occurring each year, it's occurred over and over again. And that's the way hydrology works. It's like flipping coins. If you flip a penny, you think that half the time you have heads and half the time you have tails. But each time you flip the penny, you have an equal chance of getting a head or a tail. So the fact that you've had 5 heads in a row when you flip a coin, the 6th flip can still be equally between a head or a tail. It doesn't know what the past history is. And that's what we call stochastic hydrology. most of the floodplain area, in the valley bottom area, is prone to flooding according to the FEMA flood insurance study. One thing we noticed is that in the natural channel, they tend to overtop the banks and have the water spread on the floodplain at a frequency of once every 1 or 2 or 3 years. And that's what we call a bankful discharge. In this particular channel, that's not occurring in most of the length. In general, the Focus Creek is what we call an ice channel, which means that it's eroded down into the landscape, such that during that normal bankful type of flood, which normally would overtop the banks and spread tidally. For most of the length of the channel, that doesn't happen. It takes a pretty good sized flood in a range of a 10 or 50 year frequency before water generally comes up over the banks and goes over the tide. And I suspect that over the years, it may have had some influence on the way the floodplain area has been developed. It's not an active floodplain that gets inundated on an annual basis or so frequently that it would deter people to actually develop in those types of areas, except there's a few exceptions down by the Lake Mill Road area, for instance. And so this particular channel, when I look at the channel, like, let's say we begin at Hurley Mountain Road and kind of proceed downstream from that, the kind of picture I see of the channel, first of all, it's an alluvial channel, which means it's formed in sedimentary material. So by and large, it's on bedrock or very close to bedrock at the bottom of the channel bed. It can't erode any deeper. The channel generally has cohesive banks, which means that the banks are made out of silty and clay type of soil, which predates the modern historical geology. This is old material, probably going back to at least the glacial period, roughly 12,000 years ago, perhaps even earlier. And that's one reason that the water has such high turbidity. It has a lot of color and it has kind of this brownish color every time it rains. And that's from the clay material coming out of the bank. The channel, as I mentioned, even if you begin just up the road here at Marvin of the recreational area, has been dredged. A lot of the channel has been dredged, and this is really wrecked. It has a cold water stream. The channel is overly large where it's been dredged. It's basically a mess. There's a lot of deposition occurring in the dredged pond. There's a lot of trees coming down. And the perimeter of the dredged pond is the source of a lot of trees which are actually floating down the channel during the flood. The dredging programs, I can say this from outside and everybody can be mad at me, and that's fine. They've not been managed well at all. And they go back many years. You can see a lot of them go back to the 1960s and 70s and 80s and so forth. There are better ways of dredging the stream for sand and gravel without causing as much environmental damage as we see here. Another major issue we see, and we always take a look at, is that as we come downstream, we begin running into bridges. So we have bridges in Hurley, we have bridges in Kingston, we have bridges on the other side. I always look at bridges as being a possible control in terms of floodwater, because they often tend to be a throttle. Very often bridges are undersized, they tend to restrict water flow, and on the upstream side, the water tends to be much higher than on the downstream side during the flood. And there's only really 2 bridges on this particular river that appear to have really been undersized. And generally the bridges are quite large. Many of them are 2 or 3 spans. But the bridges in 209 appear to be an undersized bridge according to the floodwater elevations that we have from the U.S. Geological Survey report. They did a report on the flood that occurred in April 2007. And there was about 2 feet of head loss. And that's what it's called the loss of energy as water flows through the bridge opening. On the upstream side, the water is 2 feet higher than on the downstream side. And that's quite a bit. The other one that appears to be undersized, but the true hydraulic flow conditions in terms of flood flow is a little bit matched by bedrock outcrop, is one at Lake Mill Road. That particular bridge shows quite a bit of a rise in water elevation from one side to the other. But because of the bedrock outcrops, both downstream and upstream of the bridge, you have to treat that as a system. The bridge itself may be okay, but maybe the bedrock is what's influencing it. It's that gradient. You have to do more computer modeling to identify that. And so we look at these constraints, and then we try to understand how the system works in terms of process and in terms of form. When I talk about river form, we're talking about the shape of the channel in both its plan view, its profile view, and its cross-section. If you took a knife and went from bank to bank and then looked at it handy-wise. What we find is that the overall width and depth of the channel is generally consistent with the watershed of the tide, but the channel is gradually shrinking. And you see this where we have what we call extended point bars on the inside of some of the bends. In other words, at one time prior to 100 years ago, prior to all these reservoirs being built, the floods that come down the river would have scoured the channel, and it would have scoured the channel and enlarged it. And during the years without a flood, you get a little bit of deposition, and the channel tends to contract. This is part of the characteristic of this alluvial channel, and a channel that's self-formed in sand and gravel. But we see that the dimensions of that channel, what we might think of the legacy channel, typically in the range of 150 to 200 feet wide. Very substantial channel. And yet with our present hydrology, with the influence of reservoirs and dams, which substantially reduce the peak flows in this river, the peak flows at the gauging station in a flood are often less than half of the peak flows upstream of the dam. So they have a substantial flood control benefit, even though that's not their primary function. But as a result, the channel itself is larger than it needs to be. It has very low velocity. And as a result of that low velocity, you tend to get sediment deposition in the channel. And there are places where the channel is most active. At the mouth of Salthill Creek, where there's like a delta of sand that comes out of Salthill Creek, it comes into the main channel, but it's not being flushed away. So the residual channel that's left at that point, when you account for that sediment, is actually the width the channel wants it to be today, as opposed to the width of the channel that needed to be 100 years ago. You see the same thing when I walk the channel upstream of the Route 209 bridge. If you stand on the bridge, and even better if you look at aerial photographs, the channel comes around a big wide bend, bending to the right, and then approaching Route 209 goes underneath the highway. But on the inside of the bend is what you think was a huge sandbar, but it's actually become vegetated, so it isn't readily obvious unless you're a good observer of these things. But it's actually narrower than the width of the channel. And the third point like that is up here in Hurley. On the inside of the bend, once again, it normally would be a quiescent low velocity zone on the inside of the bend, where sediment tends to accumulate. It has become what we call an elongated point bar that actually goes well past the bend and into the straightaway on the downstream side. And that's a good indication that the channel is in a depositional type of mode, despite the fact that we have these overly large gravel pit ponds that are just like big settling basins. Another issue I noticed along the channel is, having done the work back in early September on Labor Day, we heard good rainfall this summer. It was not an unusually dry summer. And yet the channel is largely encroached. We saw a great many algae nests on the channel. We saw a lot of floating algae. We saw a lot of rooted aquatic vegetation in the channel. And usually that's from excessive nutrients. And so the channel itself has become so rich in zooplankton and phytoplankton that it looks like pea soup at times. And even today I suspect if you look at it, it's not clear water. And that's because of the really luxurious mass of plants that are growing in the water itself, plants that are floating in the water column. The channel is prone to low flows because we have a lot of the flow being regulated from the dams, unnecessary facts to supply water. Prior to going out and inspecting the channel, there are a lot of comments that I picked up on concern about woody debris in the channel. And we did see a few places with woody debris, places with banks that have caves and a few trees in the water, a few places where they collected primarily at the inlet and outlet of some of the dredged gravel ponds. But for a watershed this size, the amount of woody debris in the channel is actually very low. And it's not a deep, log jam type of pack that's very high above the water. Like we sometimes work on these wild rivers up in Maine, and the log jams can be 10 feet above the water level, and the water is kind of flowing through the log jams like water flowing through spaghetti. And the amount of woody debris we found on the channel, even though it's evident in a few places, and I'm sure it's a nuisance for boaters and canoers, is actually very small for a river this size. The same thing in terms of bank erosion. A lot of the channels we work with, particularly do suffer 3 significant floods in the last 5 years. And looking at the gauging station record, they actually have about 43 years of record for the gauge floods, although it's not 43 years in a row because there's a gap in the middle. The 3 out of the 5 highest floods that we've had have all occurred in the last 3 years. And so that was normally expected to go out and find a channel that's prone to this type of flooding and find massive bank erosion. And that channel's way of trying to adjust its dimensions in proportion to the unusual sequence of floods, and not having had the time in between the floods to fill back in the sediment again. And yet we didn't see an awful lot of bank erosion. There's some areas of erosion, but quite frankly, as a percentage of the total channel, the numbers are very small. So the channel's not in a great deal of distress in terms of either log jams or bank erosion. And I imagine that's a little surprise to you, because I know in the beginning people seemed very concerned about the log jams. But if you go back and look at things like the water profile that was plotted by the U.S. Geological Survey from the flood in April 2007, it doesn't reflect the influence of log jams. They have a very flat profile. Literally, the length of the channel behaves because of 3 different lakes during the flood. It doesn't have high velocity except when it comes down by Hurley Mountain Road or you're in the vicinity of Lake No Dam. Generally, it's not a high velocity channel where a little bit of debris will allow them to cause a great deal of problems. And then we look at some of the flood-prone areas. The U.S. Geological Survey had photographs that was extremely helpful that documented some of the flooding that occurred along the channel in 2007. We had a few times still in the 2005 flooding. And then we have seen the flood insurance credit that discusses the flood hazard area. And I look at flooding as very simplistic. Floods are a natural event. And the structures being flooded is because of only one of 2 reasons. Either the water elevation of the channel is unnaturally high, such as because of bridges obstructing the flow of the fill material, or you have a case of people just develop too low. And so by and large, that's the case on Focus Creek. It's not so much that the flood water is unusually high, but rather people have developed in areas that would naturally be prone to flooding. And so they do get flooded. There are a couple of very dangerous areas along Focus Creek. I know one of them was a former trailer park that was located up in the northern region. And it's gone. I saw it on an aerial photograph, and you see all these trailers along the riverbanks, and think, oh my God, that's the last place in the world they should be located. I went out there to see what it looked like. It looked like a concrete foundation with the kind of a ragged dike. And so that's actually good. They obviously, you people have done something to remove occupants from the floodplain. What's that?
It got like that in 2005.
Okay.
The whole thing got like that. So I was like,
I'm not surprised. And on the opposite bank from that area, there's a local park in extremely sensitive area. It's on the inside of the bend. And you can actually look on the photographs, look on the aerial map, and I've confirmed it in the field, is they have these old oxbow bends, which are the remnants of an old channel, which is migrated sideways, leaving the old channel behind as an isolated oxbow lake. And there's actually developed areas in between the banks of the Martin River and the Oxbow Lake. So realize that even though you have a flood insurance that defines the boundaries of the flood, the entire river can change course there. It's characteristic of an alluvial channel, what's called an avulsion. And in looking at your maps and the geologic survey, it's gone through a number of avulsions, which is a little bit unusual for the northeastern area. Usually we don't have a lot. But you have 4 or 5 very significant oxbow lakes on the floodplain that are remnants of the former channel location. One of them, by Route 209, I suspect was a man-made cutoff and tried to straighten the highway to straighten the channel a little bit. Most of the others appear to be natural. And so there are substantial areas where there's people at risk and homes at risk. I mean, literally people built right on the banks of the channel. And there's not an awful lot you can do to protect them from flooding through manipulation of the channel. You'd rather have to think what we call a non-structural type approach of raising the homes, and call a number of homes which have been raised, or trying to flood-proof the structure. Because you can never expect to really lower the floodwater levels below natural levels. And right now there's nothing to really suggest other than a couple of bridges that the flood levels are abnormally high. The flood levels are where they should be. So it's not the flood that's the problem, it's the house that's there the problem. We also looked into the question of levees. I noticed this town chamber Washington Avenue, there's a fairly substantial levee, a dirt levee and a concrete flood wall behind the shopping plaza. And I was looking at Washington Avenue in particular because it's one of the areas that had significant flood damages in 2007, possibly in 2005, I don't know that. And as is often the case, there's a levee immediately downstream of the flood-prone area. And levees are kind of like a double-edged sword. They can protect properties from flooding that are on the floodplain area and by creating a wall that isolates them from the river. Almost invariably, construction of levees will raise the water elevation. And I would not be at all surprised if some of the flooding that occurs at Washington Avenue because of the levee on the downstream side, raising the water elevation by preventing the water to spread sideways. And then people literally flood themselves out. The other levee was found by where the old mobile home park was. And that levee was a dangerous levee. And there's a famous quote by former Brigadier General, the Army Corps of Engineers, who talks about levees. There's only two types of levees, or two types of dikes. Levees that have overtopped, and the levees that will overtop. And when you live behind the levee and depend on it, that's a very dangerous situation, as they found in New Orleans. They have to be continually maintained, and you have to be continually graded. We haven't really talked about this in terms of hydrology yet, but most of the Northeast, including New York, have substantial increases in precipitation over the past century, up into the range of about 20%. And we think if we have a 20% increase in precipitation as recorded by NOAA, the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, a lot of them are reflecting having higher peak flows. And so areas that are protected by levees that were properly designed in accordance with the standards of their era may not necessarily be high enough in the future. We simply get more rainfall. And we're finding this consistently throughout the Northeast. In many cases, we have channels that were physically stable, as indicated by very mature 2 or 3 foot cottonwood trees on the banks and things like swamp maple that tolerate the water, and all of a sudden these banks are eroded. And a lot of it looks as if this is a natural phenomenon. We just plan on getting a lot more water in the coast. And it's going to continue that way from what we can tell from climate change. Climate change is not something new. It's been going on for 12,000 years. The Earth is warming. We're still in a post-glacial warming trend. And with it, we're finding increased evaporation from the oceans. There's increased churning of the atmosphere and increased precipitation. So I always get kicked out of people worrying about climate change. It's not new. 12,000 years old. I worry more about having the next glacier than I do about global warming. Because we will survive global warming, but we're not going to survive the next glacier. We're closing in on the end of the interglacial period. Our cycle has been glaciers for 100,000 years, and then 10,000 years without a glacier, and then having a new glacier. We've already used up that 10,000 years. So that is just kind of a quick summary. Look at the geomorphology of the system, the valley segments. We looked at the generally concise channel. In other words, you're actually getting less flooding than you would in a normal watershed of this size, simply because the channels become crossed. And in a normal watershed, where it had not been located on something like the limestone valley, which is highly erodible, you would have found a lot more flooding than what you receive right now. That's the good news. The bad news is you do have a fair amount of single-family residential development right on the stream bank. And so when the water does come up over the bank, they are immediately subject to flooding. And we've had 3 of those in the last 5 years. As I mentioned, it's an oversized channel for today's hydrology. It is infilling the sediment, which is going to begin to approach what I think is modified hydrology. There are several places, particularly at the mouth of Culpo Creek, basically it's like a delta that extends out and covering about half the width of the main channel. It's kind of interesting. This really kind of goes over the highlights of what we're thinking about. And keep in mind, this is not a pleasant folk study. It's kind of reconnaissance to understand how the watershed is operating and how the channel is operating, and point out some of the management issues that we all face here. But so far, we don't have the answers to the management issues. We simply identify them. And identify usually cause and effect. So I like to identify the cause as well as the effect of these management issues. And that, I think I can turn it back to you and entertain questions and answers if you'd like to. Comments?
Yeah, right on the church, I'm ready to answer, and let's make them people. I know a lot of your comments first.
Yes.
From what I can gather, the drainage channel, you're talking about zoning. In terms of the real problems that you said, houses.
In fact, that's one of the first things on my list of things to do. I don't know if and when we adopted floodplain zoning, but one of the requirements of the FEMA flood insurance program is that you have some form of floodplain zoning to delineate on your zoning map locations prone to flooding in accordance with FEMA, and then to adopt standards to help minimize the potential damages that might occur within those zones. Usually we have 2 different types of zones, one for the floodway, which is that portion of the channel and adjacent floodplain is absolutely essentially needed to carry flood flow in downstream direction. And under the FEMA recommendation, you should have town requirements that prevent fill material or development inside the floodway. And usually that consists of the entire channel floodplain area on either side. It's like the center and the core of the floodplain itself. Then you have what we call the floodplain fringe, and that's also defined on the FEMA flood insurance studies. And in the FEMA flood insurance studies, they delineate the floodplain fringe as an area prone to flooding, but they don't prohibit development in that area. What they say, though, is that in order to receive a federally guaranteed mortgage, and we know the importance of that now, is that you have to elevate the structure above the elevation of what they call the base flood, which is the flood with a 1% chance of recurrence. And if you place fill material, you cannot cause adverse impact to people upstream and downstream. And generally, you can't make that determination without doing some type of mathematical computer model. I don't know and have not checked what you have in terms of local floodplain zoning in your communities and floodplain building standards, but it's absolutely essential that you do that to try to exclude future and further development in these floodplain areas. It also so that people who may be residents before these flood insurance maps are public are aware of the fact that they live in the floodplain. And a lot of the communities that we work with will go ahead and develop flood notification plans, so that if a flood is imminent, they have a way of notifying homeowners. In my town, we have a telephone system. They just have a one dial number, and everybody gets a message on the telephone. Some communities will have someone, like in the public works department, monitor a gauging station. In this case, we have gauging stations upstream, which is a little bit unusual. You actually see a flood before it gets there by tracking gauges on the other side of the reservoir. In some communities, they will have what we call emergency contingency plans. We actually have a plan ahead of time in terms of what roads are likely to be closed in the event of a flood, and we have these salt officers, salt circles, sandbags standing by public works directors, so we can put them off before the road is over top rather than afterwards. A lot of the fatalities that occur during the flood are usually people driving in cars. It's very seldom a person in the house actually drowned because of a flood. It's usually a person who drives off a bridge into the river, if the bridge is washed out, if the car gets stalled trying to cross the river, if they think the water's only a few inches deep and they can drive across it, the car stalls. That's where, in small towns, where most of the fatalities come in. And so with a good flood contingency plan, you actually recognize you may have roads and bridges subject to overtopping. We see some communities that you think that they'll post signs on bridges subject to flooding, or at the low point of the road subject to flooding, to help deter people from trying to drive across it without knowing how deep the water is. Other communities they would designate shelter areas where you have a refuge where people can be evacuated. Sometimes it's a town hall, it might be public school facilities where you have water supply and sanitation. These are all things that communities can do to kind of prepare themselves for the possibility of future flooding. Now, you guys have gone through several floods in recent years, so you may already have these in place, I don't know. But it's a way of helping to reduce hazards and reduce flooding. Any other questions? Anyway. Other questions or comments?
Something that is being an inside channel, will it get more inside, or, because I know you're saying in some sections, that's the bedrock. The bedrock.
No, we can't see the entire length of the channel, obviously. But there are so many places where there's exposed bedrock on the channel side and that I don't believe it will come further in sight than the near future. This is like geologic time. Until the next glacier anyway. So it's an incised channel, which is a little bit unusual. Usually when you have big broad floodplains, there's connectivity between the channel and the floodplain, but not always.
This goes to my second question. What was the time frame for those?
You can't really tell by looking at the map, but because the Oxbow Lake is not still in the sediment, they're probably relatively modern. And when I say modern, it's probably like 200 years.
Okay, but that's pretty decent.
Because they gradually fill in the sediment. And they disappear. And at that point, what you see on a map like we do on the U.S. map in Minnesota, you see this kind of archive line. Yeah, you see the scars and the scroll line. But you won't actually see the body of water associated with them. But at the current time, you have several that are very evident, and elephant is in the last 200 years.
I think you'll see that the main factor is the construction of the dam. And those erosions and Oxbow Lake and things were formed before before the dam.
I think you're probably
And
right.
after the dam was constructed, it changed the hydrology significantly.
Right.
If you're looking particularly in the area from the dam to Marbletown and Hurley, that channel was formed before the dam. That's why it's so big, it's so wide to accommodate the flow.
Exactly.
And it also can be seen at where the farmhouses are. If you look at the old houses that were built before the dam are well back.
That's right. I think, because the dams have a major impact on the flood flow, it may give people a false sense of security, that you don't get flooded as often. But to some degree, when you have a flood, you may have a flood that occurs with a reservoir that's full to the brink of the spillway, and you have significant discharge of all the spillway from the flood. Or by chance, you may have a flood occur when the reservoir is only partly full, and is able to temporarily store a higher percentage of water. So the fact that some of these channels are oversized doesn't mean that you can assume that you can do something with them. It's very dangerous to make that assumption. You don't know if the dam is always going to be, half full or going to be full at the time the flood occurs. But in general, when you look at all the aging records, they've had a major impact on reducing all the flood flow. And I suspect that's partly why people sense that the land is being flooded as often, and they kind of develop on the banks where it has been flooded every year. They probably be aware not to do it. It's really like a false sense of security.
I wonder if you could expound a bit on the assessment methodology that you use to do the reconnaissance report. Was it a walkover? Did you use a helicopter video cross-section survey?
We use a little bit of everything. The first thing we like to do is do things that are cheap and readily available. So, sitting in the office, you can went through aerial photographs. It used to be you had to always look at the GIS type of photographs, say when something Google Earth or Terra Server. They're both websites that have very good aerial photographs on it. Then I look at the GIS information, the geographic.
Sorry, the aerial photographs, did you look at historical going from 59 to all of that?
There's a series of aerial photographs that are available on the internet site, some from the state of New York, some from Google. We look at those. We look at the USGS site, where we have a lot of old mapping. Their maps go back to about 1900. We look at the helicopter film that was put together by the Watershed Association. That was very helpful. And then finally, we did a limited walkover, where I went to places where primarily all the road crossings and public parks and public access points. I did not do a continual walk of the entire channel. We only had 2 days of time to do field work. So we look at selected points. We focus on control points. This is control points, hydraulic control points. So specific hydraulic control points where the dam down the Salty, the Glen Erie Falls, which backs up water for miles in upstream direction, and the bedrock outcrops in the vicinity of the Latest Mill Road. Then I looked at each one of the upstream bridges and kind of spot check along the channel. We found some of the dirt roads that go through the back of the fields alongside the channel. So it was not a continuous walk in the channel.
Your assessment of bank erosion and was largely from the helicopter reconnaissance?
Helicopter reconnaissance and basically limited inspection. And that's going to be the weakness of this type of evaluation. It's not a foot-by-foot type inspection. It takes a little bit more time and effort to do. You referenced
a bunch of hydraulic geometry, and did you do cross-sections for those? Or were those,
I measured cross-sections at about 8 or 10 locations along the channel, and these were measurements we did with the laser rangefinder. So you can stand on one bank, you can look at the high water marks on the opposite bank, you can look at evidence of hardwood vegetation. Some of them say get recent flooding, you look at scour and sedimentation, but really those are not from the annual flood cycle. That's a lot of the annual flood cycle evidence of banks and discharges been wiped out by the large floods we've had that overtop the bank. But from that, we got a sense of the magnitude and size of the channel. Basically, it was a bimodal type of channel. In many places, the channel has bank height that's typically in the range of 150 to 200 feet wide, something even wider than 200 feet. But in places where we've had recent deposition, the channel is typically only about 60 feet. And that would reflect, the smaller hydrology of the post-dam type of area. So this is a bimodal Second of bipolar, we apply mobile hydrology, we also apply mobile channel cross-section. You can see the old channel shapes and then you see the newer ones that have less vegetation and primarily very expanded out.
The bank erosion that you did see, was that through new depositional areas, or was that old channel, old bank that was being eroded?
Most of it was old bank area. But even on the helicopter flight, we went through fairly carefully. It's not a big percentage of the total length.
You would attribute that old bank erosion to maybe increased water during the entire event that
We don't really know why. It could be due to higher water, some of it is due to aging vegetation. We know in some places when you have trees down, it might be due to saturation of the soil and you draw down after the flood, saturated the bank and allows the bank to slide. But we don't have enough information to make determination of why you have these erosions. In general, they're not in high velocity locations. And that's what struck me, that we look for erosion usually on the outside of bends, and I look for some of the bends on purpose. Usually the outer bank is more prone to erosion than the inside. And there wasn't a trend of that type. We look for erosion when you have bridges. Like right down the road here, you have a bridge in Hurley. The old green truck bridge. The banks in there are very stable. The vegetated, there's a couple of trees down. That look upstream from the bridge and track about 500 feet upstream of the bridge is a section of bank erosion. And yet it's not in a place that would normally be related to a flood. And generally we have cohesive banks that also tend to hold the banks together.
Is there more questions, please?
I have a few, but
Well, I was just going to follow up on what you said about, in general, the bank is cohesive. And I'm wondering if you have a sense of how much an enhanced forestry buffer would make a difference in areas where there is flooding or this.
It probably won't make any difference in terms of immediate bank flows, but the banks are generally vegetated. And in general, you do have a buffer. But what you do have is a lot of sediment coming in off of a big field. And the buffer helps to filter some of that sediment before it goes into the channel. And so when I look at stream buffers, they can have many different functions. Some stream buffers are really helping to hold the bank together. In this case, that's already in place. Almost all of these banks are wooded. And that's typical in the side channel where the normal water elevation is way down at the bottom of the channel. A lot of your channel has banks that are 15 or 20 feet high. And they look like forts. They're actually hard to see through. Many of your banks do have a buffer on the upland side, going anywhere from, let's say, 50 to 100 feet. And that's really important to help filter sediment-laden water from the large agricultural fields and going into the water and help reduce nutrient load. But quite frankly, in general, you have good buffers in a lot of areas, not all of them. Some of the places I saw we did not have buffers. I walked around some of those dredging ponds, and where they had a standard, literally the width of the channel by dredging out sand and gravel, they generally remove the buffer. And some of those are pretty ragged.
So I guess again, just to follow up, would you make it part of the recommendation to enhance wetland buffers or which one?
Yes, we are strong proponents of having good riparian buffers on vegetated bands along the river banks and around the wetland areas. I don't know whether your vegetated riparian zones are because of chance or because of regulation. They may be too wet to farm, for instance. The ones I saw, some of them are actually dry. They potentially could be farmed if they weren't protected by regulation.
what's your opinion of the value of a federal study? It sounds like from your assessment, a lot of the major issues might be beyond the authority of the federal government to deal with more locally.
Which federal study are you talking about?
I'm saying to continue with the war feasibility study.
We saw an outline of question for a feasibility study. I didn't find a lot of substance in it.
Well, they didn't do it, but they did a concept study.
Right.
Yeah. Right.
That really didn't help me at all.
Right. So, I mean, given the issues, many issues are not really structural, or they might be more things like planning type issues.
Right.
Local planning, not federal planning. You give a time frame, it takes about 45 years to get of value to the user, and should we be trying to do that, or do you think this is something that should be looked at?
You guys have to talk to the court, because the one thing that should help you with is possible buyout and relocation from the properties that are prone to flooding. And the flood insurance has about 3 different river ring programs, and one of them does allow them if you have a benefit cost ratio greater than 1, which means that you have to be able to demonstrate substantial damages to receive federal funds. But in some of these areas that I call the riverbank cottage type communities and seasonal homes that are turned into year-round homes, it would be nice if we had federal funds to help acquire some of those properties or raise them up.
We've been trying to do that in our town. I think 1 out of 10 houses, 50 qualified, because there's not enough there.
Exactly, and that's the trouble of speaking of that. You have to be flooded pretty often to qualify under the federal program in terms of having a benefit cost ratio.
It's also income. It's income
Yeah.
qualification and the housing value qualification.
Yeah, like above poverty level.
Right. Then the court also has to claim pure flood control funds, but those funds are generally fairly limited. But once again, you have to have very substantial flooding to qualify for federal flood control type of funds. I'm not sure you have that to qualify for frankly. Then the third type of federal program is active stream and river restoration program. And particularly we have habitat loss, but once again it's subject to cost-benefit ratios, and we're competing with other river basins throughout the country for those types of funds. And if you have rare endangered species, if you have archaeological sites, if you have historic sites, if you have other factors that help you compete, you can't get that type of fund. But that's something we have to talk to the court directly. But looking at their reconnaissance report, I didn't see anything that really said this is the most valuable river in the country that we should go out and give our
Right,
dollars
again,
for.
you think sufficient interest is, I don't know, there's no support your answer, I don't know if the conclusion of the council study was, yes, there's interest. It sounds like there is, because my understanding is they're seeking cost-sharing funds, and so if they weren't interested, they probably wouldn't be seeking cost-sharing funds. So my general sense of getting information about the council area is that interest has been established, it's just seeking cost-sharing, but as you say, they have to prioritize relative to other river systems that might move their own. They can't do them all.
Right.
So, there's something that how are we communicating with the Corps in terms of establishing what we think the issues are? How far has it? Is there a liaison for, or?
Well, Sandy, it's Rookie Sandy to do that.
Yeah, they're interacting, and we attended the presentations on our stakeholder email list. They were invited, they got a copy of the report. We never heard from Warren, they're having quite a lot of staff up until the final result of that reconnaissance study, when they said they were looking forward to look for the cost share. But they're aware of what we're doing, but this is the first step for us to have something to bring back to them to say, this is what we think. But they're certainly paying attention to what's happening with this group.
I remember the original, that DEC was sort of taking a coordination function with the youth. They had a provider there, right?
Yeah, the DEC is providing the coordination for the local cost share with sub-agreements with Ulster and Orange County, is the general plan is called, if that last meeting we're at that.
There has been a letter sent from the DEC to the court regarding the reconnaissance study. The gist of it all is that there is interest in providing a cost share, but nobody knows where the money's going to come from. The DEC has met with representatives of Orange County and Ulster County, all the way from Blackbird to here. And the issue now is, one of the issues, probably the main issue, is where is the money going to come from? In addition, that study is primarily a habitat enhancement study, with flood is an ancillary benefit. It is not by any shape a flood control study. You have to remember that. if you read the reconnaissance report, it is very clear. Flood benefits are ancillary to the project. And that's what I know about that.
So, it's kind of continuing to circle then, is it possible that partnering with the Army Corps could enhance a future watershed management plan for the lower surface? I mean, it seems like some of the impact, say, from gravel dredging over the years has maybe impacted the habitat of the streams in certain areas. So if the restoration focus of a long-term project for watershed management for the lower coasts has that focus, then that's possibly the direction to go in for partnering.
If you wouldn't mind, I hate to jump in and give a thought, but you have to be clear on the biological implications of the habitat. The lower Soka Creek biologically is impacted because there's no water. It's not the gravel mine, it's not the dredging, it's because it's dry pools in most years. There is no water from the dam down until you hit the main tributary. That is a biological fact. Now there are other things, but before they were working on the dam and there were releases to the lower Soka, everybody that lives there knows it's dry pool. There was no water in it. And in fact, the excavation at Hurley Sand and Gravel and those other ponds were among the only refuges for fish, and they were the only places to find it. So I think the impact of those excavations are perhaps overestimated. I wouldn't worry about it.